All right, we're live on both cameras.
Yes,
it's all very
sir.
exciting.
Good stuff.
We're ready to rumble. So no book this time, but we read a New Yorker article.
Yes,
We did.
It was called Tim Morton's Hyper Pandemic or something to that effect.
That was very good. That'll get you close enough.
Yeah, close enough. So you can look it up. It's in the New Yorker. It was good. It was a bit of a lengthy read, and Gabe just read it just before we were recording, so he's super fresh on it. But
Hyper objects. You want to know what hyper objects are? Stay tuned.
Exactly. So Timothy Morton, who is he's a philosopher, an environmental studies philosopher, originally from England, studied at Oxford, and he comes to America and begins
He did his degree in English.
Yeah, exactly. So he did a degree in English, and then eventually does a PhD at Oxford in romantic literature, and then decides to try and make it in the United States. And after a long time, as a lot of academics do, he works a variety of positions, and then lands at Rice University in Houston, Texas, of all places. Yeah. What a place to contemplate the environmental collapse, from Houston, Texas. But no, what's really cool about him is he's sort of one of, or they are, I should use they are one of these sort of philosophers who are looking at trying to get away from the human-centeredness of philosophy and what they would call the anthropocentric nature of philosophy. So what they view is that pretty much since Kant, there's been this idea that the only way to produce an understanding of objective reality is to look at how the mind interprets what it sees.
Yeah, so our philosophers at home, this is the separation between phenomena and noumena.
Yes, exactly.
Keywords.
Exactly. And leading on to that, what they take is instead they take a phenomenological approach. So they borrow a lot from Husserl on that. But where they break with a lot of sort of the older generations of philosophers is they say, it's not the correlationism between the human and the non-human, or the human and the object, that produces reality. Like, it's not the relationship between the mind and what it observes that produces reality.
Yep.
What they're saying instead is that every single object, from this glass to this microphone to you to me to everything, essentially has its own internal intrinsic reality that's not dependent on anyone observing it. So it's an objective reality, and it's an object. That's why they call it object-oriented ontology instead of subject-oriented ontology, is that the ontology, the being, the nature of being, is in the object itself. Right. So, one of the great ways that this is often talked about, and it comes up as in the article, is that there's they'll often use
and that's different from the subject, because having a subject implies some sort of observation. Exactly,
some sort of position from which to observe something else, and therefore pass judgment on it in some ways. And they're really trying to level the playing field. So they talk a lot about leveling the ontological playing field. So instead of us, in their worldview, instead of humans being humans being the subject and everything else being the objects in which we observed, we are just little tiny objects in a cosmos of large, vast, and ultimately much, more durable objects than we are. So the idea is that it kind of is a complete decentering of the humans as having any kind of primacy in the world. Yep. Essentially, we have to just exist along everything else. So that's kind of the lead up to sort of Timothy Morton and why he's taking on this object-oriented ontology. But it's really interesting when it applies to climate change in particular, because Tim Morton writes this book in 2013 called Hyperobjects. Right. And this is directly coming from object-oriented ontology, but is their own kind of spin on it. So they, for example, define hyperobjects as large, nearly but not quite infinite. They are finite. And they exist in objective reality, but they are ultimately unknowable because of their vastness. And that sounds very confusing, so I'm going to give an example. He uses in this article the example of styrofoam as a hyperobject. Right. So we have an understanding that styrofoam exists in the natural world. It has an objective reality, but we can't go around counting every single piece of styrofoam that's out there. Especially now, a lot of styrofoam and its adjacent plastics are within our bodies too, right? They've broken down to such a degree. So Timothy, they are wrestling with this question of, okay, how do you define an object like styrofoam, for example, that has objective reality, but you try to observe it, you try to quantify it, you try to measure it, it's impossible to do so.
Right.
Because it's disseminated through all these different systems. So that's where the term hyperobjects comes from. Mm-hmm. And then they go on to say that global warming or climate change itself is also a hyperobject in that it is vast, it's rooted in objective reality, but it is ultimately unknowable because it is vast and it's disseminated through space, what they would say through time as well, since we are experiencing the effects of global warming now, but we also experience them 100 years. So they kind of are bent. They would argue are bending kind of time around it a little bit in that way, metaphorically, because they exist both in the present and in the future. They extend beyond time scales. And they use this as a way to kind of look at the environmental crisis and the moment in time as both a kick in the butt, let's do something, but as the more mainstream environmental voices would, but they also use it as an opportunity to look at, okay, what's our position in this? Like, how do we think about things differently? And how do we, if we look at things like global warming as a hyper object, how do we relate to that as objects ourselves? Not as subjects, but as objects.
So to clarify a bit, I believe for hyper objects, all objects can be sort of assigned a hyperobject. Mm-hmm. So you choose a particular thing, shoes, for example, and then the hyperobject of shoes is just all the shoes.
All the shoes,
Yeah. So that's just clarification.
Yeah, exactly. Super simple, like that. And it gets obviously more complicated when the object in question, like, say, is a very complex system like global warming or climate change, right? They just get vaster and vaster. But yes.
But it's still in theory the physical mechanisms.
And it's still finite, right?
Yeah.
And that's the key, is they're not infinite.
But it has to be attached to an actual object.
It has to be attached to an actual object, yeah. So I kind of wanted to bring this up because it's a very different and unique approach to both philosophy and the environment. Yep. And it, raised some hair on the back of people's necks in both those disciplines because it's pretty radical. But I wanted to give space if you had any questions, but I could also talk about some of the ways it's kind of fed back into kind of philosophy and environmental studies a little bit.
Yeah, so I suppose you've done a lot of research into this. I'm curious for you what the appeal of a sort of an object-oriented ontology would be.
I find it a very interesting appeal. My appeal is quite niche on it, and it's not only Tim Morton who's doing this. There's another writer named Graham Harman who's kind of the pioneer of this. He started out with speculative realism. But what these sort of philosophers are doing is they're dancing around the idea of entity. They use objects in the titles of their books often and in the keywords in their articles, but you'll see them as they describe object-oriented ontology or objects as part of this ontology. They tend to drift towards entities and using the term entities. And the reason I find that is really interesting is because it's very relational.
Yep.
And
they're having trouble separating out their objects.
Exactly.
Because they're calling everything an object.
Exactly.
Like, I need a subject. I can't call things subjects.
So I gotta call them entities, right?
Exactly.
And what I like about object-oriented ontology and where people like Tim are starting to go with their new book, which we didn't talk about because it's not in this article, but they're turning towards more spiritual questions or cosmological questions with this, and they're thinking about, okay, how do we relate to things if everything is just an object, right? And then what does that mean if actually we understand objects not to be just kind of lifeless and sort of inert but alive and living? What does that mean for how we relate to them if the primacy of the human is no longer valid philosophically? So one of the things that I really pull away from this writing and this thinking is this idea of you are ecological already, and this is something that Tim talks about. You don't have to go, to the protests. You don't have to do X, Y, and Z. You are already an ecological being.
The ecosystem.
You're part of the ecosystem
definition.
by definition, right?
Yeah.
And what they're also saying is that whether you like it or not, when you see things this way and see yourself as entangled, objectively in this kind of object-oriented ontology, it becomes much harder to say, switch off and compartmentalize the different actions in your life. So, they bring up a lot in their writing about kind of eating meat or, cutting down a tree. If the idea being that if a tree has as much philosophically objective validity as you do as a subject, it's very difficult for you to kind of cut it down if you have an awareness of it, right?
So I think you're pretty much on it, but one of the things that is interesting to me, and then I'm hoping you'll explain, is object-oriented ontology is a very conscious attempt at creating at rescuing, some would say, an objective narrative of the universe.
Yes.
But our past historical attempts at creating objective narratives of the universe have basically universally fallen apart because somebody, usually the person or the group of people who have been placed at the bottom of whatever natural hierarchy has been created, have complained that they don't actually think that they were born to be at the bottom of said hierarchy.
Yes.
And thus that the objective structure of universe might not be the right one. So how is it that object-oriented ontology avoids falling into that trap that, say, the Nazis and or all sorts of other people trying to produce historical ideas of civilization that culminated at a particular point?
Right.
How is it that object-oriented ontology has avoided that?
Absolutely. Well, I think it's a great question, and I think it hasn't avoided it completely, and it's kind of wrestling with it right now. So, for example, Zizek.
Of course.
Zizek,
Zizek?
Oh, yeah. He
Slavoj.
Slavoj. Yeah, exactly. He does not like object-oriented ontology for this very reason, because he's saying when you erase the human subject, right?
Well, it deprivileges ideology.
Exactly. Exactly. Right, and it's it's also historically it's not a great track record when we
remove subjective experience
from the equation, right? But in reading,
for people at home, subjective experience is things like that hurts.
Ouch.
That's a subjective experience.
Yes, exactly. I don't want to move there. Exactly. And I think the person I admire the most, who's wrestled with it the most, is this guy Tim, because their orientation is so relational. Yep. And it's how they challenge it is through a very kind of personal take on it.
Yep.
So in the sense that, how they approach it is talking about objects being entangled within the self.
Yep.
And they talk a lot, for example, about forever chemicals, plastics.
Yeah, they seem very concerned with ingesting things. Viruses. And,
exactly.
Vaccines, yada, yada.
Yeah, especially at this time this article came out in the pandemic and things like that.
Course.
So I think kind of how they approach it is almost, and how Tim, especially, they've outlined how they've approached it in interviews, is using almost like kind of an advice column in some ways, where they're talking about that this isn't so much, this isn't so much like a sort of rallying cry or a manifesto. It's an honest sort of look at where we find ourselves, but is really asking the reader to pick up the pieces and kind of run with it. So it's a very kind of personalistic philosophy, if that makes sense. It is making larger claims about the world, but it always attempts to locate humans and especially the marginalized humans
Right.
within it. So Tim, for example, spends a lot of time talking about racism and sexism embedded within environmental studies universities.
Right.
You
and
know.
he sees that as more overt because of
Yeah.
because there's no sort of the tangibility of class or whatever is muted by his multi-perspectives.
Exactly. And so they see the kind of project of reducing the primacy of the human as extended to extinguishing the primacy of the white male, of extinguishing, the primacy of men over women, and kind of really, well, they approach it as sort of in this reality of each kind of object having its own sort of validity and its own depth to it.
So for him, so this is interesting, and I'll apologize briefly to the mathematicians at home if there are any, but so he seems to consider these basically that each hyperobject is a countable, uncountable sum.
Yeah.
So you can physically count up the number of them, but then whatever number you reach, it's all infinite and they're the same size afterwards.
Yeah.
And this for me, at a more sort of rigorous level, this is something that for the hyperobjects concept is for me a little challenging.
Yeah.
Because again, and you're welcome, I assume, to any of the mathematicians out there, as somebody who's done a bit of math, the first thing that sort of leaps into my mind when you say, okay, I have this object, it is a countable number of sort of things based on itself that you can select out of it. What I immediately go to is, okay, hyperobjects are really interesting. What's the smallest countable number of hyperobjects we can find? And I think it's quite easy. There's obviously a whole set of unique singular hyperobjects, and then as we keep changing our classification, we expand the number so and so. And to me, there's an analytical process there where you try and find the moment of breakdown.
Right.
This is the pile versus heap problem.
Yeah. Well, they bring that up a lot.
Yeah. Right.
The heap paradox. Yeah.
All of that. So to me, that on sort of an analytical level, it's firing red flags everywhere, and hyper objects to me seem like they are the vision that I'm getting in my brain is essentially. The entire universe, and then there's like a magnetic point at somewhere arbitrarily in the universe that sucks every single object of that type to it in the universe. So you have a hyper object for erasers, and every eraser instantaneously appears together. And for me, what's very noticeable about this universe is as we go through our objects, we have these sort of natural, fundamental physical qualities of the universe. Like we get a hydrogen, and like all the matter in the universe essentially zips towards our single point. But if we take that hyperobject and we compare it to, I don't know, the hyperobject of something that is absurdly common here on Earth, cell phones, the radical difference in scale. We're literally comparing a fraction of a tiny planet to the entire universe, the entire physical, visible universe, essentially. To me, it's those radical scales. I know this is just not where he's going with these concepts. To me, those radical different scales and sizes of hyperobject leap out much harder than this sort of assumption that they're having, which I'm finding very interesting, of this sort of equalness of perspectives between type. And that to me is where the more interesting part of that idea is. The idea of privileging the perspective of hydrogen with the perspective of cell phones or with the perspective of humans or cats or whatever. That's where you get into a really interesting territory for me.
I would agree, and I think that's why they kind of skirt around these ideas of entities as well. I think part of that I don't see as much Tim doing as somebody like a Graham Harman is the object part of object-oriented ontology is his baby, the scholar Graham Harman, who's an American. And he spends a lot more time defining his lectures. You know, he actually has a debate with Zizek as well, right? Where he's like, this is how we've defined an object. This is why I'm using the term object. You know, I don't want you to think of objects as unsteady. He's really trying to deconstruct the object, even as he's asserting a whole ontology based on it, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Tim, I find, doesn't do that.
Yeah.
Tim's more interested in these kind of more really ultimately subjective questions when applied to how do we relate? What is it like to think about the perspective of hydrogen in the universe? What is it? You know, that's more where Tim is going from. This almost like kind of, yeah.
For me, there's a bit of just total post-structuralism.
Yeah.
So they have this total post-structuralist worldview.
Yeah.
But combined with the, you know, whatever bizarre knowledge or motivation that kept the early post-structuralists from just, you know, blowing their brains out.
Yeah.
You know, it really, this joy of life and this acceptance of how beautiful and wonderful this universe is. You know, I mean that's very objective stuff that he's going for there. I think at least.
Yeah.
But you know, that's really powerful, you know.
Yeah.
Having the ability to so post-structuralism, basically we're dealing with the absolute abandonment of narrative.
Yeah.
Right? That's the simplest way of looking at it. So any structural narrative is gone. So why is this glass here? It is. Yes. There are many different reasons it could be here, all of which are valid.
Yeah.
This is essentially post-structuralism.
Right.
In many sorts of ways, it's an incredibly freeing intellectual discipline. But you do have this problem, which is, okay, you know, this glass, who cares why it's here, right? Who cares? But I think that I'm a good person. If I treat that the same way I treat the glass, who cares? Maybe I'm not. That might actually have a really radical effect on how I view myself, on how I treat people, on how people treat me.
Yeah.
Whereas, you know, the glass, hey, I don't care about it. It could go.
Yeah.
So this is what post-structuralists. Oh, this is what post-structuralism really like hit the mainstream and just exploded.
Yeah.
You know, every news article in the 60s or whatever wrote about this stuff was like, you know, God doesn't exist, happiness is a lie, rainbows aren't forever, you know, whatever it is, you know, all just like this elimination of this basic, you know, Western civilization is a figment of your imagination, whatever it happens to be. But many of those structuralists, we know because some of them are dead now, and they left us stories, lived happy lives. They experienced joyous things. They still managed to love and enjoy the beautiful world and universe around them, despite some of them legitimately having no real intellectual observation, being able to make no real intellectual observation as to why it was the way it is or how it became the way it was, you know, in very legitimate ways. You know, truly, some of these guys totally break down narrative structures to the point where, do they themselves have narratives? Are they people? You know, good luck.
No, it's true.
Yeah,
it's really interesting because Derrida is actually Derrida read Timothy's stuff.
Wow!
You know? Apparently. Yeah, I was reading that one of Tim's earliest books Derrida actually read while he was still alive and liked it. So
that's really cool.
So I think you're very, very persuaded on it, and I think it gets at a fundamental problem with this kind of approach, and even Tim is having to kind of deal with it. So 2021, Tim writes a book essentially that's called All Art is Ecological. It's about 100 pages long, very short intro into this stuff. Very good. But, you know, ultimately comes to the realization that the God, especially the patriarchal God of Christianity, cannot exist in this universe, right? There cannot be a God that's cleanly separated from all the other objects involved, according to Tim.
Okay.
Yeah. and
Okay.
that God, that a separate God that's kind of just set the universe in motion and removed itself isn't possible in this world.
Right. Yes. As always, a subsection of Christian belief.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, it's always now, and funny enough, now 3 years later, 2024, Tim's new book is Hell in Search of a Christian Ecology, right? So, I listened to an interview with Tim about this, and essentially I'm thinking, okay, why are you, I thought you let all that stuff go, right? Where's the flip? Well, essentially what Tim's saying is, I can tell Mr. Truck Driver in America, Tim's saying I really wanted to speak to Americans, especially in this moment in time during the election, and to do that properly, I need to speak to Christianity in some ways because it's very relevant to those people's experience. And Tim has this funny line where I can say to Mr. Joe Truck Driver in America, like object-oriented ontology, lack of subject, all this, but that guy is still listening to his pastors telling him Jesus loves him anyway. And he's correct. So Tim actually has said, I had to kind of go and look at, Christianity as a whole. And it's really interesting because in that interview, suddenly Tim starts talking about spirits and spirituality. Tim starts talking about the devil and starts talking about God. And so there is a sense that, to get back to the point you raised, is that, these aren't all necessarily objects on a level playing field for everybody. And that when we come and look at the actual experience, it's like
very much not so.
It's very much hierarchical, right? And Tim's now having to deal with that, in this new book when they open themselves up to kind of a Christian perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I got a lot of thoughts on this. They partly, if you speak English and you do enough intellectual endeavors, you run into a body of work that is just produced by some branch of Catholicism. It's just how it works.
That's how we do it, baby. It's true though. It's gonna be there.
Yeah, and that's just a historical reality of how our intellectual tradition was formed.
Right.
You go read the books, go read the history. It's obvious why it was the way it was.
Yeah.
Seeing him have to confront that reality, or them, having to confront that reality is really interesting.
Yeah.
Seeing them struggle and have to use this new set of language, I also find really interesting because that's just something I've been struggling with over the last several years.
Yeah.
Like with all the stuff that I worked on, I really hoped that people would just be interested in my sort of structural analysis of things,
right?
And I was wrong. People were interested if you could. People are interested if you can show them the result,
right?
If you can show them why it's good, why it's interesting, what it helps them do, that helps a lot. But if you're just thinking about stuff and trying to figure things out, people have been doing that for so long in so many different ways.
Yeah.
They really need something else to give you why am I learning your 4 pieces of lexicon?
Right.
There are many words that I do not know, and there are several words off the top of my head that I could not define properly. Actually, that's quite hard to do. There are several places in my knowledge that I know I could go to and know very few of the words.
Yeah.
And I would have to learn many more words in order to know them.
Yeah.
And this creates a limit on all of us as we learn about the world.
Right.
We are constantly faced with new information, and reflexively we decide whether or not it's worth including or not.
Right.
And this tied back. Sorry, what was I talking about at the start of this?
Oh no, you're talking about kind of this problem of having to use this new lexicon or language and just trying to figure stuff out with it. I think
exactly. So each time you come up with something new, you're sort of forced to either use an old word for it that disguises the fact that you think it's new, or use a new word for it and make things more challenging for people.
Right.
And that's really hard because that forces you to look at all your work and go, okay, object's a great word. I like object.
Yeah.
But maybe if I'm trying to talk to people in general, I don't use object anymore.
Right.
Because it's too familiar.
Yeah.
They've got too much baggage associated with it.
Yeah.
Maybe I need something cool. Maybe object is actually a really general word, and people have way too general a set of understandings of it. And what I actually need is a specific word that they recognize much better.
Right.
This sort of decision making about which words you picked and which.
Yeah.
And it's something every time you go through and create a new structure, you're like the words you spend way too much. Like even if the structure is like how you're breaking down your day. Or what's this part called? Morning or the lunch, dinner. But inevitably you end up putting funny names on them and doing silly stuff for no apparent reason.
Right.
And the way that people are labeling things and the way that these labels are used are incredibly important.
Yeah.
Are incredibly important.
Yeah.
And this use of labels in object-oriented ontology is also, of course, really important and interesting.
Yeah.
At a basic level, that simple transformation that you pointed out earlier, where you go, hey, we're talking about objects a lot. Everything's an object. If everything's an object, that sounds a lot like an objective statement that is above and beyond object-oriented ontology.
Yeah.
That implies a much greater set of structural rules and
true.
And structures, if there is that level of remove that's possible.
Yeah.
Or at least to me, but.
Yeah, no. I think what you've picked on is really important, because I think it gets to the tension between a kind of, macroscopic and microscopic viewpoint, and I'm really interested in this more because it asks the right questions rather than a toolbox for defining what an object is.
Yeah.
To be fair, I think they spend a little bit too much time on the object stuff.
Academics.
Yeah, the academics. Yeah, and they got bills to pay. They've got to. So I find that the questions it asks, like the questions it asks around empathy are really interesting. To try and actually step into the mind, quote unquote, of something with no
styrofoam.
Mind, or rocks.
No,
or pebbles.
That's hugely valuable.
And it's also like, this guy's finally getting there after a career of like pretty much niche Buddhism and a real hard rejection of what they saw as patriarchal Christianity. This guy is finally getting around to discussing spirituality with much more nuance, even in the Christian world, right? They're looking at traditions that are not just like white and male within Christianity, for example. And they got back together with a friend of theirs from Jamaica recently, and this person talks a lot about the devil and spirits, and Tim had to ask themselves, am I just going to dismiss this all, right?
Yeah.
Or am I going to actually have to deal with this and figure out a way to talk about it? And those are really interesting for me, because it's about sort of asking questions about our relationship with the world and our relationship with the different entities we have inside it. And I think it's beginning to, where I really get at it is when they start talking about ideas as objects and ideas as kind of persisting in a sort of durable way in the world. And that's interesting for me because of my interest in ideas is not just static, but is potentially living, depending on how you look about them, and as potential, beings or entities, if we want to use that metaphor in a way.
Totally.
That's where it gets really interesting, and like, okay, how do we relate to something as vast as a powerful idea that's been in society for long? And what is our relationship with that? And how do we change that idea even as we're shaped by it, right? Mm-hmm. Those are really interesting questions that these guys skirt around.
Yep.
Yeah. So
I think building up that framework that gets you there is really fast.
Yeah.
No, that's really cool stuff, buddy. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. This is a good one.
Real pleasure to hear your thoughts and opinions on that.
Appreciate it.
To learn more about.
Ooh, triple O.
Fantastic. Hold on,
Great
buddy.
stuff.